and welcome to Different Leaf, a show for new and experienced cannabis consumers. I'm Brit Smith. This episode, we're hopping across the pond back to my home country of England to see what the US can learn from how the UK does medical cannabis. Medical marijuana was legalized in Britain back in November 2018. Ever since, it's been available for a growing number of people through either private doctors or through the National Health Service, the NHS. However, there are only 3 medical conditions that will qualify someone for medical cannabis on the NHS, including rare severe forms of epilepsy, adults with vomiting or nausea from chemotherapy, or people with muscle stiffness and spasms caused by multiple sclerosis, MS. However, on the private medical side, British clinicians have been prescribing either cannabis flower or oil for a much wider array of ailments, including pain, arthritis, endometriosis, Crohn's disease, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, chronic fatigue syndrome, terminal cancers, anxiety and depression disorders, including for pediatric patients. There's a long list of dermatological issues and much, much more. But out of the 67 million people who live in the UK, less than 18,000 currently have a medical marijuana prescription. There are plenty more Brits who are still accessing their cannabis through the illicit market and treating themselves at home for all kinds of ailments. Today, we're going to talk about how British residents can get a medical cannabis prescription and why they might benefit from moving away from the underground market. Our guest this episode is registered nurse Sophie Hayes, a cannabis specialist nurse based in London who is currently a clinical trial manager at LVL Health, an organisation dedicated to conducting clinical research into cannabis medicines in the UK. Nurse Sophie is going to tell us about the process and the cost of getting a cannabis prescription through a private practice, what kind of dosing and other medical advice is often given to patients, whether there are any legal concerns or protections from police for those with a prescription, what kinds of cannabis products patients will get through the post. Yes, medical cannabis is indeed mailed to you in the UK. And what the cost is for buying legal versus illegal weed on the British Isles. We'll be right back with nurse Sophie Hayes to see what the US can learn from how the UK does medical cannabis. Thank you so much for joining us, Sophie. Let's talk a bit about your background first. What's your educational background, and then what do you do right now? Where are you working?
I'm clinically trained as a registered nurse. I worked in accident and emergency departments and intensive care full-time up until the end of 2020 for, obvious reasons. That was my clinically trained background. And then my partner in 2010 got diagnosed with Crohn's disease. And he found cannabis very helpful for symptom management, like anxiety, like pain, sleep and insomnia, gut motility, appetite. So there were lots of things that it helped with. And I think us being the kind of people we were, we just weren't satisfied for it just to sort of accept that that was how it was. It just works because it works. I wanted to understand it a bit more. I think through reading and through talking to other people, we found other patients who found the same thing. They were using it for their symptom management, but they had an array of different medical conditions. So like multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, anxiety and depression, epilepsy. And I was just fascinated by the fact that it worked for so many different kinds of conditions. And my partner and those patients formed a advocacy organisation in the UK for patients who were looking to access it medically. That was in 2014 they formed that. I supported them and many of the patients who were involved in that group up until the law change here in 2018, where it became legal on prescription. And then post first and second wave COVID, I left Frontline and I got offered a job in a cannabis prescribing clinic, and I was the lead clinic nurse there. And then I organised a conference at the Royal Society of Medicine in the UK, educating consultants in pain specifically. After that, I got offered a job as clinical trial manager for the first cannabis flowers and chronic pain study or clinical trial to be conducted in the UK, which is what I'm doing now. It's much more it's a less intense pace than frontline work. And I recently set up a consultancy with my colleague. And the idea of that is that we're a consultancy that anyone across the world who wants to set up a clinical service or a company in cannabis medicine in the UK can use our knowledge. Basically, mine's very clinical based and hers is very research based. But I also wanted to give nurses a platform to be more autonomous, pick the projects they want to work with, the companies they want to work with, have their own, set their own rates and be valued for the skill set that they have.
I mean, you're blazing some trails in the UK, I'll say that much. So speaking of your pain conference that you held at the Royal Medical Society in London, that is where I first saw you. So
Right.
that is actually where I got to know about you and got first interested in what's going on in the UK with medical cannabis. My interest in the UK medical cannabis is really rooted in, obviously, I'm English and all of my family's still over there. And my father has been a doctor for the last 50 years. And so he's a member of the Royal Medical Society. And he told me, hey, there's a pain conference going on. You want to come? So I flew over and I got really interested in what you were saying at that conference about how prescription of cannabis works in the UK. Because in the US, it's very different, but we're talking about the same medicine, the same plant. To be honest, there's a lot of difference in the UK and the US when it comes to medicine, whether that's pharmaceutical or cannabis. So can you explain sort of in the UK what the process is for getting a medical cannabis card and then what the process is for actually obtaining that medicine?
So there is no card system for a start. So there are sort of organizations within the field that are trying to support patients who can't afford a private prescription, but the card is not a necessity in order to get a prescription. So the way you get a prescription in the UK is that you find their private clinics online. There's about 18 of them now in the UK. They're functioning privately, which means you have to pay for the service, pay for the doctor, pay for the medication, which I realize in the US may not be as big of a shock as it is when people who are fortunate enough to work with the NHS in the UK, where everything is free at the point of contact, meds, clinical care, everything, aftercare. So it's been a bit of a challenge, I think, in that respect, that it only is allowed to exist in this private space for the minute. But you contact the clinic, you submit your medical records for review. The doctor will see you, and that combination of their assessment of you and your medical records will be approved or not approved by that clinic for a prescription. Then the doctor will have a conversation with you and possibly the rest of his or her clinical team about what the right medication would be for you. And that can be based on your experience as your patient. What I talk about a lot is that difference between the two, expert patients and what we would call cannabis naive.
Okay. So once you've been approved for a cannabis prescription on the private side, then you and your medical team decide what you'll be taking, largely based on your previous experience with weed. So I'm guessing, not to brag, but I would be an expert patient. How long does it have to have been before you are considered a cannabis naive patient?
Cannabis naive patients will be patients who've never even considered cannabis. They've never seen it, held it, smelled it, used it. It's just completely new, but they are at that point where they've tried absolutely everything and they have nothing left. We have pain management programs in the UK, which are a fairly recent introduction, that include ways that are not pharmaceutical to try and manage your pain, because previously the option was, I'm sure you're aware, was that you just be prescribed more and more different kinds of opioid medications, right?
Yeah.
So there's that group of patients. And then there's another group of patients who have been managing themselves, their symptoms, their conditions with cannabis for literally decades. And so they're now having to renegotiate their relationship with their body, their relationship with their condition, and their relationship with cannabis. And they're now having to negotiate that with a doctor who many of them consider not to know as much as them. And I think that is a really difficult place for patients and doctors to be in, because patients have had very negative experiences with doctors in the past before it was legal. The responses in disclosing your cannabis use to a doctor ranged from, if it's working for you, we'll just pretend you didn't tell me and let's see how we get on, all the way to, I'm going to report you to social services and police. I'm not going to take care of you anymore. So for that reason, a lot of patients have a lot of distrust for the medical community, understandably so. Now that control has been taken away from them that they feel they have by using cannabis themselves. They're putting it back into the hands of doctors, and they're having to learn to trust the medical community again. So a lot of the education for doctors and patients is not just about how it chemically works. It's about how you come to that decision together. I literally did a talk at a patient conference, the first patient conference in the UK for cannabis patients. Got about 15,000 patients on prescription now in the UK. And I said, this is, no one knows everything. That's something that you're taught when you start training as a nurse. It's something that's like drilled into you. You're a part of a team. The team between you will know everything that needs to be known. But you as an individual will never know everything. And when you think you know everything, that's when you start practicing badly. That's the point with an expert patient as well. You also don't necessarily know everything. Between everybody who it takes the whole care of team that takes care of you, there's multiple professions in there plus yourself, and you get the final say. But it takes a whole team of people to properly take care of someone who's complex like that for decades, especially with conditions that deteriorate like MS.
I saw that like through the NHS, and the NHS, the National Health Service, is free and open to any UK resident. But they've only ever prescribed like 3 or 4 medical cannabis patients. And it's only for 3 different issues, right? It's for MS, certain types of epilepsy, and pain from chemo or cancer.
Yeah.
And that's it. But when you look on the medical side, there's like dozens and dozens of different ailments that you can come and get a prescription, a recommendation for. How do you dose the medicine? Where do you start with learning to dose something that's a plant substance and is not really, as I understand it, that easily available in the UK?
Yeah, so obviously all the clinics are clinics, they're clinical services. So it's just the doctors and nurses, the pharmacists and the patient. The decision is made there. So when you ask the question about how you decide about dosing, that again, whether that patient has already used cannabis before or whether they've never used cannabis before, their weight, their age, their comorbidities. If you have someone with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, for example, a common like comorbidity alongside that is POTS, so postural hypertension. So you will drop your blood pressure very suddenly and feel very faint, right? Yeah. THC also will drop your blood pressure. So I wouldn't necessarily start someone, even if they were experienced, I probably wouldn't start someone like that on a THC flower, for example, because flower is so immediate acting. It can be a very sudden change in experience. So when people who've never used cannabis before will say, I feel disassociated, or, I feel funny, or someone even said that they felt more acutely aware of their pain because of THC. So the decision really is about having a conversation with that individual. It's so different to how I've been trained in the respect that it really is, every prescription is a tailor-made conversation or a tailored conversation with that patient to find the right medication, the right combination, like the right ratio, whether it's an oil or a flower. We have some limited capsules, but we don't have topicals or suppositories, which I would love because there's lots of people where I would prefer to give those formats.
But where do they go for the medicine? Who's making it? Who's producing it and selling it?
So they basically pay the clinic for the clinical services, and then they send the prescription to, there's literally 3 pharmacies in the UK that are able to dispense cannabis medicines. And so the clinic will send your prescription to one of those. Now, they don't all have the same list of, they don't have the same pharmacopoeia. They don't have the same list of medications available. So the clinical teams have to make sure that they're aware of all the different medications that are out there. And that's just a case of, as a doctor, you're allowed to literally, or a nurse, you're literally allowed to go to the pharmacy and say, this is my qualification. I'm working in this place. They're registered to prescribe cannabis medicines. I want to know what your formulary is so that I can make that decision with my patient. And they'll send you a list, basically. That's how it will happen. The patient will then have a phone call from that pharmacy when they receive the prescription. The pharmacy will then arrange for it to be delivered to that person's home. So no one queues here to go and get cannabis meds. They have it delivered to their home.
That's really different.
It's good for chronic pain patients, particularly people who have anxiety and agoraphobia. You actually don't have to leave your home. It will come to you, which is, I think, a really, really positive thing that people have said.
I think delivery systems are a really great way to do medicine. My husband is a veteran, and over here there are Veterans Administration hospitals, and it's the closest thing, I guess, to the NHS is the sort of government-sanctioned healthcare, but only for military veterans. And they send medication the same way, and it does make life a lot easier when you can get it. There are a lot of states out here where you can also get your medical marijuana and some recreational marijuana delivered to you, so that's really helpful. What about following up with patients as they sort of learn to use the different flowers, or you said it was oils? Those are the only two options, right? How do you follow up with them and change their dosing and sort of maybe it's a different time of day that this works for you? How do you work that out with them?
So every clinic will do it differently, but the nursing community is so small in cannabis medicines at the moment that we actually all know each other. So over time, we've developed what we have decided collectively is probably the best way to do it, which is a patient can only get a cannabis prescription for a 28-day period in the UK. At the end of that 28-day period, they need to be reviewed by a clinical professional. So it doesn't have to be the specialist doctor, it can be a nurse. So a lot of the nurses will spend a lot of their time with their caseload is following up each month, either with a phone call or with a video call to see how that patient is doing. For the job that I have now, which is a research project, there is an application on your smartphone that connects to the inhaler, and that will basically send us all the information to say you are actually taking it, you haven't had any side effects, and just that we get that in real time for the research project. So there's lots of different ways, but predominantly that's quite new. Predominantly it is actual phone calls and conversations with nurses.
There's so much interaction in the UK medical field with your patients. I think that that's really what's lacking in the US is I don't have any more feedback with the one doctor that gave me that license, 1 year ago. I just have to apply for it to be renewed every year. And I just go to the pharmacy and a lot of the time rely on the bud tender to tell me in the dispensary what they like for this issue or what they've heard is good for that issue. And sometimes there's some research on terpenes, which are the chemical in the cannabis plant that produces the smell, the flavor, and a lot of the time those will be really therapeutic and that can sort of guide patients. But I think that what the US can learn from the UK is to rely more on the studies and the research and the feedback from patients and make it more of a pharmacy experience, because you can go into a dispensary and you go in one line for medical and they serve you at these checkouts, at these tills, or you go in the other line for rec and they serve you at these checkouts.
That's
and
so
it's the same, it's the same flower, the same products, but you can get a higher level of milligrams on the medical side than you can on the rec side. That's really the difference. It's like you can have access to more products and higher levels of it. But there's just not that guidance, and I would really love that sort of medical team behind me helping me figure out what really would work for me.
I was going to say, does your current medical team outside of cannabis know you're using cannabis and have conversations with you about it?
Yeah, they do. So it's really, really easy here because it's been legal for so many years. To tell a doctor, like my GP, my regular practitioner, that I am a daily cannabis smoker, and he'll be like, okay, so that will interact with this and that. And like, there's a lot of doctors out here who do their own research to keep up with it because it's legal, and a lot of adults out here use it either recreationally or medically, so they have to know
That's really good.
What that impacts for them. But I also have, I can tell my mental health practitioners, no problem. They know about it. They'll know about some of the interactions. They'll keep up with a lot of studies, especially in Boston. It's like a very medical community out here, like so many hospitals, But even my dentist knows about it. Like she's telling me, she reads up on. Everybody's interested in it. It's there's just not enough room to do the research. So I love when we're able to do that team group thing where we all pass along all of the knowledge that we have and enhance each other. It's a much better way, I think, to do healthcare.
Definitely, I think so.
It's still illegal. It's what's considered over there a Class B substance. So there is medical efficacy, but it's still considered an illegal drug right what are the penalties if you're found like growing your own at home, or if you're in possession of illegal cannabis?
That's different if you're a parent administering it to a child and if you're an adult. So if you're an adult and you're caught with possession, that's up to the discretion of the police officer who's arrested you or searched you as to whether or not it's enough for them to consider prosecuting you, basically. It's whether it's up to the discretion of the police officer, but it is illegal. Then there's possessing enough for intent to supply. To supply other people is definitely an arrestable and court offence, and that people do go to jail for it often. And then growing your own, whether that can be classed as intent to supply or whether for personal possession, I think the cutoff point is about 9 plants. But again, I hesitate to draw definite lines in that to say, if you have 9 plants, you won't go to jail. But if you have over 9 plants, you will. It's still at this point. The conference I just went to, a patient who is also a lawyer outlined it perfectly, that they basically got the policy for cannabis prescription management or cannabis management for every police force in each county in the UK, and they were all different from one another because each police force is independently not being educated in a unified way. They're going through individually depending on what the population is like in that area or the number of arrests in that area. So there is very little protection. If you are a parent who is administering cannabis medicine, you can have your child taken away from you because you'll be reported to social services. It's people who are still doing it outside of a prescription, either because they don't want to engage in prescriptions and that private system and they want to have control, or they can't afford it, which is more often the case. They're putting themselves at huge risk still. And I think a lot of people talk about decriminalization being a really important point. And despite it being a totally different country, everyone here was very excited that Joe Biden made the decision he had. I don't know what the real life application of that is and how long that takes and all of that. So I appreciate what is said is probably more positive necessarily than the real life application. But it's a definite good place to start, especially when we realize that the communities who are more often imprisoned are not privileged communities. They have profiles, and that sort of just a problem that is endemic still within, I think, a lot of police forces, really.
Speaking of the underground market, do you know the difference in prices from what somebody might pay on the prescription side versus the underground side in the UK?
So patients report sort of in the UK prescribed flowers. Let's go with flowers because I don't think oils underground, they are available, but they're just not as prolific as flower. So in prescribed medication, in prescribed flowers, it ranges from £5 a gram to £13 a gram. That's dependent on quality, dependent on who's producing it. On the black market, patients have reported anything between £10 a gram. If they're lucky, they'll do things like patients talk about. They have dealers they have good relationships with. They will buy in bulk, which makes the price per gram slightly less, but average £10 a gram. On some of the aisles, so like Guernsey and Jersey, when it was during COVID, because they didn't have a legal supply, no one could leave the house, so no supply was coming in from mainland into Guernsey and Jersey. People who were growing on Jersey, clearly, because otherwise how would it get there, were charging from £50 to £80 a gram.
Oh, they were monopolizing. Oh my God.
Because they could.
You can. That's actually a lot cheaper than we get in the US. So, right now the pound and the dollar are pretty similar.
Yeah, pretty similar.
For issues we will not go into. But on the legal side, you've got £5 to £13 for a gram. That's about the same as $5 to $13 for a gram. Over here, you'd pay probably $10 to $20 for a gram. But that's on the legal side, and you'd then have to pay some taxes on top of it. I usually go for like an eighth, which is 3.5 grams. It would run me between $30 and $60. So it's a little bit more over here. We're a little more expensive over here. It's interesting to hear that during COVID, there was a real booms in these places that couldn't get imports.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, to bear in mind, I suppose, with the prescribed model, patients that's the price of the medication, and patients who were using cannabis previously were used to paying, obviously, on a black market for cannabis. But what the additional cost of actually going to a clinic and seeing a doctor, that's the price that's on top of that.
Yes, okay, so with however much you're spending on flour or oil, the medicine itself, you then have to add on the cost of seeing the clinician. How much is that visit usually?
A consultation will range anywhere between £50 and I think probably the most expensive one now is £95. But these are some of the top consultants in the entire country,
Yeah.
and they're charging their normal rates per hour. If you saw them in a normal private clinic, would be £450 plus an hour. So
Mm-hmm.
actually, it's just that, like you say, because of the NHS, and we're so lucky, but we're also very very privileged, lucky and privileged, very like close terms in this respect.
Hmm.
Is that we're not used to paying for our healthcare, so anything above nothing feels unjust. And
Yeah.
I get it. Prior to being a nurse, I was a care assistant. Before I was a care assistant, I was unemployed, and like that idea that you don't have any money really means I don't have any money. There is nothing spare, So I appreciate that often the people who require a prescription are also people who don't have a lot of income. So trying to make that decision and make that assessment is a really difficult one.
Yeah. Do you see any change in the future, anything changing in the politics in the UK that might allow for more medical cannabis patients on the NHS?
Well, really, I think we talk about in the UK, like you said, that the emphasis is on research, and we have such a very strict bureaucratic process in order to get medications to the NHS. So we're trying to fit cannabis medicines into an existing medical model. So the only way we can get any of the medications onto the NHS is by doing clinical trials. So that's why I moved from the clinic to do trials, because I was like, the end of every conversation, every article, every interview was more research is needed. So I was like,
Yeah.
all right, well, let's go and do the research.
Yeah.
But there's still, because of lack of funding, only 3 clinical trials going on in the UK for cannabis. We are one for cannabis flower. There's another one for CBD in isolation for COVID, for long COVID, and there's one
Hmm.
for a combined 1,000 milligram oral CBD and then a short-acting THC, isolated THC, for schizophrenia. So that is
Wow.
like, that's very brave, which is like they are basically trying to see whether long-acting CBD being onboarded onto a patient system who has schizophrenia stops any kind of side effects of psychosis from THC. That's a fascinating one. I think there's only about 20 participants. Yeah.
That's incredible. I definitely have to follow that. There are some really, really interesting studies that come out of Europe. You know, that's another big reason that I like to follow Europe and South America, you know, in comparison with what we're doing here in the US, because the laws are so different. And you know, I hate to say the word Brexit, but Brexit
No,
really
it is.
really
No,
messed up a
no.
lot of the medical access that we had in the UK. I'm just really glad to see that the UK is able to somewhat start standing on its own 2 feet by doing its own internal research on cannabis, starting to think about cannabis as a medicine on the NHS. I know it's slow and everybody is ready for it to move faster, but that is a really big move. And it's only been a few years. There are moves being made, but it just seems to be, they take the sweet time over there in the UK. They're quite conservative.
I think as well, because it is like, it's not only a practicality of research and funding for research, but it's also changing culture and attitudes within both the medical community and the general public, which it has got to a certain point where I think most people, for example, can understand the idea of being in pain and wanting it to stop. I think a lot of people in the general public understand that, and can empathize to a certain degree, so have less of a problem with cannabis being used for pain. But we still have very poor education around mental health in general.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people struggle more with trying to empathize with it being prescribed for mental health, because not everyone is self-aware enough to be aware when they are experiencing mental health. Pain is very obvious
Yeah.
experience that people feel like they can understand.
Yeah, so there's very much still that stigma surrounding both weed and mental health in the UK. But more than half of British adults said in 2022 that they supported legalization for people over 18, like complete legalization. Why do you think that is?
On one hand, I understand why people want more legal access, because they look at the US and they think that actually having that autonomy and being able to try multiple things without having to justify it to someone
Yeah.
medical is in some ways a really positive thing. And you can tell me what your experience is otherwise, but some people really like that. But there are also people I find that are very passionate about cannabis and are very nerdy about it, and it's their niche. It's the thing that they understand the ins and out of. Most people don't want that. Most people just want their medicine and to get on with
Yes.
the rest of their life. It's not they're also their hobby or their passion outside of it. My fear is that obviously a lot of patients who've used cannabis for decades are pro full adult use legalization, but I'm very conscious of the fact that there's so much potential for cannabinoids not just in symptom management, but I used to work in accident emergency. We are in an antibiotic crisis where we don't have, people are becoming immune to certain antibiotics. I think CBG has potential for antibiotic properties,
Yeah.
and antifungal. There are drugs out there. There's medications that are potentially going to come from cannabis that will revolutionize healthcare in ways that we just don't understand yet. And I would hate
Absolutely.
to not see that happen.
Yeah. I also want to ask you how you talk to your patients about the method of ingestion, because only oil and bud, like cannabis flower, is legal to be prescribed. And many medical marijuana patients that I know over here in the US still smoke their medicine because it's what we know, I guess. Where do you stand on advising people to smoke?
Patients can, if you to talk about that idea of cannabis and where it sits in your life, a lot of my conversations with patients at the clinic were talking with them. So experienced patients who were like, I know what I want. I want this flower. I want this much. I'm going to use it this many times a day. And I was like, okay, but you're telling me that you want to spend £650 to get flower so that you can administer flower every 2 hours. That's not cost effective. It also indicates that your symptom management needs to be managed in a longer acting medication like a tincture, which will last between 6 and 8 hours. I know what you're saying. I know what you've done is have a make-do regime that has worked really effectively because of prohibition. Let's try this together and see if it makes a difference. And more often than not, those patients tried combination scripts, moved on to different longer-acting medications, and the feedback was not only that symptom management was better, but their quality of life was better, not just because their symptoms were better, but because cannabis didn't take up all their life.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't you didn't have to think about making sure you had supply from a dealer, that your dealer was out of stock, that they wouldn't have the thing that you needed or that you found most helpful before, taking it into gonna go visit family who don't want to talk to me anymore because I use cannabis. It removed all of that. And they realized how much time they had to do other things that they had enjoyed before. Like open sea swimming was a really common one for some reason. Everyone's really
What? That's random.
Going back to school, going back to work. That's for me one of the most interesting things aside from the chemistry, that feedback.
That's what I like about the English way of doing this medically, is that it's really looked at holistically. How does this impact your whole life? And how does your whole life impact how you might use this medicine? And sort of looking at how it can help you socially, how it can help you in all different areas of wellness, whether that's intellectual wellness, going back to school, or financial wellness and working at your job, There's just so many different ways of thinking about health and wellness.
Yeah.
There's so many things that I want to take from what the UK are doing and tell the US, look, it's going slowly, but it seems to be going well. There seems to be a real support system for people that do go to private practices. I'm not sure about the NHS, but at least that go to private practices. There's a real support system that you get from a team of people who are experts. They know what they're doing, and they can get you access to medicine that really helps you. I wish there were more grants. So, there's so many things that could be better. I wish there was more financial help, more access. But I just think that there are a lot of things that we can take in the US from how other countries are doing things. And just to know that you never are doing it perfectly, just like you said, working in that team, we need to take from others' strengths and see where we can improve. So finally, before I stop picking your brain, which has been so fascinating, where can cannabis curious potential patients go? Where should they start if they're looking at ailments that are not covered on the NHS, like depression or anxiety or post-surgical pain, anything that they're interested in for the cannabis? Where can they go? What can they do for consultations?
There are probably, to start with, the first step is looking up the clinics. I know that there are websites, like resources called opencannabis.com. Open Cannabis is a website where it basically is support for patients interested in accessing prescriptions, and it will list the clinics basically. So it's like a good place to start. You will then call those clinics. It should have contact details, and you will be able to find the clinic that has the right specialist for you, the right price point, and you'll be able to make that decision. But have a look at all of them, I would say, before you make that decision. Don't just go with like the top one because it's worth having a think about where you want to sit for like the next however many years. So that's what I would say.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Nurse Sophie. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
No, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's been really fascinating. And hopefully we can check back in a few years maybe and see how things have progressed.
Absolutely.
Thanks to this week's guest, clinical trial manager and registered nurse, Sophie Hayes. Next week, we'll be learning about the culture of CBD in Japan with Mike Idlin of Walala CBD.
There's a spice in Japan, a red spice called shichimi togarashi, and there's hemp seeds in it. And so Japanese people have been eating hemp seeds for many years, while essentially, and this might be a bit of an extreme word, but being brainwashed that cannabis is, highly illegal and highly dangerous by the Japanese government. So when it comes to today's kind of CBD market in Japan, basically the rules are your CBD product must come from the stems and the seeds of the cannabis plant, and it must not contain any THC.
Be sure to like and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening right now, and follow us on social media at Different Leaf, and I'm on social media at Brit the British. Check out differentleaf.com for all the issues of our beautiful winter magazine, which is all about medical marijuana, including my latest article on page 62 about the pros and cons that you should be weighing if you're thinking about getting a medical marijuana card in the US. The magazine and all the back issues are available at differentleaf.com, and you can get the winter medical marijuana issue on thousands of shelves across the US and Canada at select Barnes & Noble bookstores, Walmarts, CVS pharmacies, and select cannabis dispensaries. That's differentleaf.com.